I heard some questions that were sort of teasing shortage on the Colorado River, so I hopefully will address those questions in this presentation. So I'll start off with a visual of our system, the CAP system. 336-mile long canal system that diverts water from the Colorado River just south of Lake Havasu. And the canal itself moves eastwards towards central Arizona, the Metro Phoenix area. And then it moves southwards towards CAP, towards Tucson, where it terminates just south of the city of Tucson. So to understand our water supply, we need to understand what's happening in the Colorado River. So this is just a visual of the Colorado River basin. It's divided into the upper basin and the lower basin. The upper basin states are comprised of Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. And we are in the lower basin, Arizona, along with California and Nevada. And what this visual just shows you, and I apologize if it's not very clear, but it just shows you all the different diversions and basically movement of water from the river itself to various number of entities that utilize it. There's a number of out-of-basin diversions. The biggest are probably the one moving towards Southern California, and then also to the Front Range in Colorado, so servicing the cities of Denver, Boulder, etc. And what you also see is how the water is allocated between those states. In the upper basin, they're allocated based on percentages, and in the lower basin, they're actually hard numbers. And this is derived from the Colorado River Compact in 1922 that split the flow in the river between the upper and lower basin, each having 7.5 million acre feet. The total flow was 15 million acre feet when they signed the compact, and that's the number they used. So we're kind of driving the nail towards shortage and what happens in that scenario, but to really appreciate that, we need to look at two very important reservoirs in the Colorado River system, and those are Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And they both they do a number of things, but there's two main things that each do respectively. Lake Powell helps to protect the upper basin from curtailment. And what I mean by that, the upper basin has to, on a 10-year average, provide the lower basin with the 7.5 million acre feet per year. And so by having the capability to store water in Lake Powell, they can do releases downstream to the lower basin and still meet that 7.5 million acre feet requirement per year. It also helps that their entitlements are based on percentages. So if there's years where they're not delivering a full amount of 7.5, they can still get their quote-unquote entitlement because it's percentage-based. More importantly for us in Arizona is Lake Mead, because Lake Mead is what we use to determine what our deliveries are to the lower basin states, and also how we determine if there's a shortage and what happens, and I'll jump into that as well. So how do we manage these reservoirs? Currently we manage them using a set of guidelines called the 2007 Interim Guidelines for the Management of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And these give us direction on how water is released between the two reservoirs. But in our case today, I'll focus on how they're used to determine shortage in the lower basin. The guidelines itself were adopted in 2007 by Secretary of the Interior, and they're in effect till 2026. That's when the guidelines themselves expire. The expectation is that at some point before then, the basin states and the federal government will get back together and determine what the guidelines moving forward from 2026 will look like. So how do we determine shortage according to the guidelines? Under the guidelines as they were drafted in 2007, the states, and this is focusing on the lower basin of course, states of Arizona and Nevada share in shortage. As of 2012, due to an extension we call the minutes, or basically additions to the original treaty between the US and Mexico, Mexico now also shares in shortage. I forgot to mention earlier that Mexico also receives a portion of the Colorado River, about 1.5 million acre feet, and that is also released from Lake Mead. So As of the end of 2012, Minute 319, which is addition to the U.S.-Mexico Treaty of 1944, which dealt with the Colorado River, Mexico now shares in shortages and surpluses in the Colorado River. So that's good news. So the lower basin states don't share the brunt of shortage while still delivering full supply to Mexico. So that was a step forward in mitigating some of the impacts of potential shortage. But shortage is determined by the elevation in Lake Mead. And that dictates the health of those reservoirs, and according to the guidelines, under different levels of elevation, we can determine surplus, normal supply, or in this case, as I have in the screen, shortage. So the first tier of shortage, there's 3 tiers of shortage, and they start at 1075 feet and goes down to 1050, 1025, and in each respective elevation, as you can see, there's a certain volume of reduction that the states of Arizona, Nevada, and now Mexico partake in. As you might have noticed, I mentioned 3 basin states in the lower basin. The one that you see that's not up there, that doesn't share a shortage, is California. And to really just kind of summarize a history of why that is, one of the concessions made to have the Central Arizona Project Canal built was to protect California's sort of senior priority. And so that's partly one of the reasons why it was built, why they don't suffer a shortage, and we're able to build the canal and actually move the water from the Colorado River to most of where the use is, which is in central Arizona, most of the population is. So under the guidelines, California suffers no reduction. So I'm throwing numbers at you, but let me give it to you in a more relative way that's easier to digest. So I talked about 3 tiers of shortage. Let's look at the worst case scenario, not to be a pessimist, but just to paint the picture. So if we have a tier 3 shortage, that's the most extreme level of shortage, that translates to a 7% reduction in water supply going to the lower basin, which is the normal supply is 7.5 million acre feet. You take that a step further and apply it to Arizona. Arizona then takes a 17% reduction to its 2.8 million acre feet allocation. Then you take it a step further to CAP, and there's a number of assumptions in this graphic here, but assuming that other higher users in Arizona that are along the river are using the same amount they use today, CAP would suffer a 30% reduction. So it does propagate down the impact as you focus on more specific users. And I have a graphic at the end that shows if there is a shortage, how would that translate to CAP and its customers. So I talked about how we move water if there's a shortage, but what drives shortage? Why does that happen? The most obvious is hydrology. And what I mean by that is the water that's generated in the upper basin. So if you look at the sort of hydrology of the Colorado River, about 92% of the supply of the river is generated from the upper basin. So almost all of it is coming from the upper basin, and I'll talk about where the hydrology comes from in the next slide. So if you have less water being generated in the system, that obviously translates to less water in the reservoirs, and that could lead to a decline in the elevation and could drive us to shortage. The next thing is uses in the upper basin. So even though there's protection against curtailment for the upper basin, if their uses increase, that can still cause a slight dip to the water supply moving into Lake Powell from the upper basin. That has a cascading influence onto Lake Mead. And then, just like I mentioned, Colorado River operations. So the interim guidelines fall under that. So based on the management policies we've adopted, that influences shortage, depending on how we do that, in this case, per the interim guidelines. And then finally, the lower basin uses. So if our uses increase than what they are today, that puts more stress in Lake Mead, so that drives its elevation down. And then finally, something called the structural deficit, and I'll explain what that is, and hopefully I have a slide on that. Perfect. So the structural deficit is a term that's used to describe the mass balance in Lake Mead. And it's a scenario where we are driving Lake Mead further than what it should be. And this is once again, per the guidelines. So if you look under a normal year, usually under a normal year, the inflow into Lake Mead from Lake Powell is about 9 million acre feet. That's under normal conditions, no shortage, no surplus. If you consider the deliveries we make downstream to the lower basin and Mexico, it's 7.5 million acre-feet to the lower basin states, plus the 1.5 million acre-feet to Mexico. And if you also consider some of the losses along the system from Lake Mead to Mexico, just evaporation, seepage, etc., you have a net loss of 9.6 million acre-feet from Lake Mead. On top of that, you have to incorporate or consider evaporation from Lake Mead. It's a huge reservoir. There will be a lot of surface evaporation. So on average, in a normal year, this is obviously just generalizing the numbers, but in a normal year, Mead loses about 1.2 million acre-feet per year under normal conditions. And that's what we refer to as the structural deficit. So what does that physically look like? This is a graph showing Lake Mead elevation from the year 2000 to the present with a little projection period at the end. And it shows you pretty much all of those years, with the exception of 2011, were normal years. 2011 was a very wet year. And if you notice, even under those normal years, we do have a downward trend in Lake Mead elevation. So that's one of the issues we've identified that we want to address, is the structural deficit in Lake Mead. So personally, in my opinion, the biggest driver is the supply, the amount of water that's generated from the upper basin. So what drives the hydrology? What causes the hydrology to produce less stream flow in the river that translates to less water in the reservoirs? If you know the water balance, this is not rocket science, but it's really primarily influenced by climate. So if there's climate conditions in the upper basin that cause it to be drier, less wet, less storms moving through that system, then that means there's less precipitation. Less precipitation means less snowpack, and that's primarily the water source for the stream flow in the upper basin. Is winter snowstorms increases the snowpack, and we get most of our water from spring snowmelt that happens in the system, and that really drives the runoff that's in the river itself. So these are the sort of water balance impact to water supply. So per the guidelines, how do we sort of mechanically declare if there's a shortage? I gave you sort of the general idea, but how is it actually done? This is a graphic from a report produced by the Bureau of Reclamation that we look at on a monthly basis. It's produced monthly. It's called the 24-month study. It provides a 2-year outlook from the current month into the future. And there's a number of data, there's a lot of graphs and data in there that describe the health of all the reservoirs in the system, not just Lake Powell and Lake Mead, but there's also smaller reservoirs in the upper basin and other smaller reservoirs in the lower basin. And this study is important because it is how we determine if there's a shortage for a following year and if there's a shortage declaration. So I'm going to explain briefly how that's determined. So the August 24-month study is the study we look at to see if there will be a shortage for the following year. So for example, this year, and this is actually from this year's 24-month study in August, if you look at the end of month December elevation for this year, so let's see if this works. So right here is the end of month December elevation of Lake Mead, basically the end of year elevation of Lake Mead. And whatever that elevation is, that gives us the indication on what the status of the reservoir will be next year, if there's a shortage or not. This year, I mean, we've been very close. This line over here is 1075, so these 3 lines are showing the 3 triggers of shortage. Up here you have the line that indicates if we'll be in surplus. We're not close to that at all, but we've been very close to 1075, which is the first year of shortage, and what you'll notice is the end of month projection is just above, about 1083 feet of elevation. That tells us that 2016, there's officially no declaration of shortage, so good news. But that's how it works. We look at the August 24-month study and its projection of the end-of-year elevation in Lake Mead, and that's what tells us if there will be a shortage or not. So obviously we track this report very carefully on a monthly basis to see how we're doing. So current status, Mead's about 1080 feet elevations, that's 39% capacity full. We're already in 2015, so no shortage. And just as I described, based on a 24-month study, there's no shortage declaration for 2016. But one of the other things we do is we do a lot of simulation modeling, projecting to the future to see what are the probability of shortage moving forward. And based on the most recent study, there's only about a 18% probability of shortage in 2017, and then 2018 is about 52%. So we seem to be good on the short term, but the risk of shortage moving forward deeper into the future is still a threat. So assuming there is a shortage in 2017, what would that mean to us in the CAP system? What does that translate to? This is a projection of our deliveries for 2017, and it just shows our different long-term contract pools. And the higher priority is at the bottom, and as you go higher into the bar, those are the lowest priority. So just generally describing the pool, our highest priority we refer to as priority 3 is actually Colorado River priority. That's along the river itself in Arizona. And there's a couple of contracts that we deliver because those users that actually have those contracts aren't along the river. So we deliver those for them through our canal. After that, you start moving into our customers, our direct customers. You have Indian priority and M&I, municipal industrial, so this covers cities. I believe City of Glendale does have a contract there with us. There's a non-Indian priority pool following that. It's a little misleading because originally it was designated as non-Indian agriculture, but has since, the water there has since been used to meet both Indian and M&I priorities, but the name hasn't changed. So all of those are long-term contracts. You go higher than that, we have our agricultural pool. So these are agricultural customers that we serve in central Arizona. And then you have your other excess pool. And that primarily provides water to the Arizona Water Banking Authority to store underground, as well as water to the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, which enables growth to happen, or I should say, new development to happen, and other short-term uses. So if there is a shortage in 2017, a first-tier shortage, it would primarily impact our other excess pool and then would start dipping into our agricultural pool. The good news for City of Glendale, it doesn't impact any of the contracts that City of Glendale has with us. So good news there. So some of the simulations we looked at looking into the future shows that there's a potential, some of the really more extreme scenarios show that there's potential for us to go even deeper into shortage, more beyond the first tier, towards moving past 1075 and starting to approach 1,000 feet elevation. The reality is, yes, Arizona and Nevada do take shortage at 1075, but if we start going into much deeper levels of shortage, it impacts almost everyone in the lower basin. Southern Nevada Water Authority, which diverts Nevada's share of the Colorado River directly from Lake Mead, they have intake structures. As we go towards 1,000 feet elevation, it starts to impact their capability to draw water in the system. I believe they just finished an intake that diverts water close to that level. But even if they're able to divert, or I should say pump water out of the lake, if the lake level is that low, they start having water quality issues because instead of pumping water from deeper in the system where it's cleaner, then you have water that's being pumped closer to the surface. So there's water quality considerations that they have to look at. And if you're at 1,000 feet elevation, you're less than 4.5 million acre feet of storage in the system. If you recall, California's allocation is 4.4 million acre feet. So even they will start to have issues as well. And then the other obvious component is if you're reducing water to this level, you're definitely impacting Mead's capability to generate power, hydropower, because you're not at an optimum elevation at the lake to be able to generate power or most power. And then if it's really dipping below that, then you're starting to impact the infrastructure, cavitation, instability, and so forth. So there's impacts to everybody. So here's where the good news comes in. There's a lot of doom and gloom, but obviously CAP, we've been we've known this is a reality that can happen, and we've been planning for it for some time. There's a number of adaptation strategies that we have been involved in. The biggest one probably is storage. One thing we do very well in Arizona is we store our water. We've been planning for a while, and CAP and the Arizona Water Backing Authority have close to 3.7 million acre feet of Colorado River water stored underground that we could utilize at a later date. Another effort involves conservation efficiency. Brock Reservoir, which is in the southern end of the system, enables us to capture flows that otherwise might be delivered to Mexico in excess of their treaty requirement. And on that note, we're also part of a work group with a number of the other lower basin states and the federal government to address excess and bypass flows to Mexico. And this basically refers to, once you get to the lower end of the system towards Yuma, if there is water that has been ordered by agricultural users and for some reason it rains, they may not divert the water all the water that they ordered, and usually that water ends up flowing to Mexico as excess flows. Also, there's a salinity treaty requirement between the United States and Mexico where we're obligated to deliver water to Mexico that meets a certain salt content. And if for some reason, and this actually has been the case in recent years, if the water in the river itself, due to return flow from agricultural users, busts that salinity differential, we have to bypass that extra return flow. So it wouldn't count and wouldn't be in the Colorado River, and Mexico would receive it as bypass flow. And that's because we want to be able to meet the salinity differential requirement. And then a couple of big projects involving system conservation. The basin states and the federal government got together and generated a pool of funds to provide to other Colorado River users or contract holders to be able to come up with innovative ways to conserve water in the system based on their use. And then that conserved water would stay in Lake Mead as system water. And the idea behind that is if they conserve water, we keep it in Lake Mead, that prevents us from going down, or hopefully halts our progress from going down to shortage by keeping Lake Mead elevation levels higher than those tiers of shortage. And then finally, augmentation. So basically, physically increasing the water in the system. A couple of things we've looked at is potential desalination projects in the lower basin, either in coastal California or in the Gulf of California in northern Mexico. And the idea there is those users that get Colorado River water, if they have a desal project, they would reduce their use by the amount of water they generate from desal. And then another more interesting and fun project is weather modification, which basically means cloud seeding in the upper basin. So we fund projects with other lower basin states in the upper basin to generate more water from precipitation. And with that, I can take any questions.
What guidelines are in place to determine when the stored water underground is accessed?
I'm not sure specifically at what level, but as far as guidelines and regulations, this water that we store with the Water Banking Authority, it's through the Water Banking Authority that's determined. So they'll be able to provide direction and guidelines on that.
If by 2017, say, unless we get a tsunami of snowpacks on the Sierras and the Plateau and the Rockies, as California goes, does Arizona go and possibly cutting their ag reduction by 50%?
Is there a possibility of reducing ag by 50%? There's a possibility of reducing ag. And one of the ways that could happen is through those conservation programs, the Pilot System Conservation Project and the Drought Memorandum of Understanding. And that allows agricultural users that would like to conserve, and obviously they'd be compensated for it, to reduce their use, to demonstrate that there's a real reduction of water through their conservation. And through that, there is a possibility to reduce ag. But wholesale permanent, that depends on the ag user. That'd be a tough question to answer. But they can, at least in the short term, through incentives such as these programs.
The compact that you have with California, did I understand that that will not expire until 2026? And when do we cut off their supply or shorten it?
I'm going to try to answer this in a way that doesn't get me in trouble. The interim guidelines, which is for the lower basin states, correct, it does terminate in 2026. And the idea is that sometime before that, we will get together and have some new version that kicks off post-2026. Cutting off California's water completely, probably not very likely. But here's the reality. You know, I talked about us going close to 1,000 feet elevation, and something I did mention that's in the guidelines is once we get to that, towards that elevation, below 1025, there's a discretionary piece in the documents where the Secretary of Interior can step in and sort of direct how we make deliveries. So, meaning he would, you know, he or she at that point in time could say, well, we might have to shift deliveries so Nevada does, or Las Vegas doesn't run dry, or Phoenix doesn't run dry. So there's a possibility of that happening. However, we feel in the basin states is that we'd rather make efforts like the system conservation and so forth, so at least we have control of how we use the water, because we don't know what the Secretary will do at that level. So we try to at least have more control of our destiny that way by implementing these programs.
On the other graph, we could see our really strong downward trend for Lake Mead's water level. With all the efforts we're making, are we going to be able to counteract that, maybe form an equilibrium at some point? Or will we have to resort to things like maybe cutting down on the population? Because, of course, as the population increases...
That's a good point. I'll answer the first part of your question first. I think they do have an impact, and some of the programs we've done have been into play before the declaration for non-declaration of shortage for next year, and I believe part of that is because of some of the things we've done have enabled us to kind of slide above the shortage trigger. Unfortunately, we can't control population growth, but obviously the less population you have, that definitely could translate to less use, at least from the urban side. However, in Arizona, and you could even say in the lower basin, certainly in California, most of the water use is driven by agriculture. About 60% of water use is agriculture, and that's the largest consumer of water. So that's why, answering the gentleman's question over there, can we reduce ag? These are some of the, probably the primary way where you could impact the water supply available by reducing agricultural use, but that's driven by other things as well.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you.